you very much. It's not a lovely night out there, and I gather that neither surface transportation nor subsurface transportation is really doing what it's supposed to do. But I thank you for braving whatever it was that you had to brave just to come down here to see me. If you don't want to see me or listen to me, that's fine too, because this is the Skyscraper Museum, and I had never heard of the Skyscraper Museum until my friend Andrew Dolcart up at Columbia said, you ought to talk at the Skyscraper Museum, and he got in touch with Carol here. And Andrew's word is law, and so here we are. So I came down several months ago, and I met Carol and looked around the Skyscraper Museum. And I now know where I want to spend my spring vacation. It's not going to be in Fort Lauderdale. But if you get the chairs out of the way and look at what's on the walls here. Here is, I mean, most of you, conceivably all of you, are New Yorkers. Here is your city in a way that you have never seen it. Here is your city seen and understood in depth and probed in fascinating ways. I now think that there are now four museums in New York that are my favorite. I'm afraid the Met and the Neue Gallery have been there for a long time. But the Skyscraper Museum is now in there with the Lower East Side Tenement Museum as one of the great museums. And you do it all in this tiny space. And here are exhibits about high density. And when I think about high density, think of all that you have managed to fit into this really quite tiny space. Not to mention fitting us in it. We're pretty dense ourselves in some cases. So thank you very much. As Carol points out, I have written a book. Well, you don't need to look at the book. You can look at the slide. There's the cover of the book. And a friend of mine came into my office a couple of weeks ago, saw the book sitting on the table, picked it up, looked at it, and said, "Wow, Charlie, how'd you get your iPhone to take a picture like that?" Well, my iPhone didn't take that. Johannes Vermeer's iPhone took that in about 1670. And that's the cover of this book. The cover is from Holland. The back cover is a picture that was taken by Nick Noyes, who's in this room. There you are, Nick. And you got up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get out to Park Avenue north of Grand Central to take a picture of it without any traffic. God bless you, Nick. So the front cover is Holland in the 1600s. The back cover is New York last winter. And it was written by a guy in Baltimore and published by a firm in Liverpool. That ought to give you a hint to what this book is about. The North Atlantic cities. It's not a term that I had ever heard before. I had to come up with it. Here's a brief introduction to what this book is about, why I wrote it, and then what I think people who care about the Skyscraper Museum might find interesting. I started with what seemed to be a stupid, simple question. And it was about the kind of houses that we Baltimoreans call row houses. You New Yorkers often call them brownstones. And in many cases, New York brownstones actually have brownstone on the front. We don't have a lot of brownstone. Big brownstone quarries are in Connecticut. We call them row houses. But whatever you call them, you find them in some cities and you don't find them in others. And I started when I was 20 traveling around, and I saw that, well, I was used to row houses because I had grown up in Baltimore. Baltimore has lots of row houses. And I found, in fact, do I have a little light here? Well, that didn't work. Did I just turn it off? Okay. I found that, is there a pointer?
Sorry.
Yeah. Good. That's all right. I can point. If it's, it's not really polite to point, but please pardon me. You find cities with row houses in the Netherlands, the British Isles and Ireland, and the coastal regions of the United States, and basically nowhere else. And I realized that by the time I was about 23, and I thought it was interesting. I figured somebody must have written a book about it that would tell me why, and it turned out nobody ever had. So 10 years ago I said, I'm going to figure this out. The Dutch, it turns out, not only invented New York, they also invented the row house. They didn't have brownstone, please pardon them, that's why they came over here, they just wanted that brownstone. They invented the row house, they turned the rattletrap houses of medieval cities into classical architecture with durable materials. And my take on the Dutch cities is they're the most pleasant cities in the world. If there are more pleasant cities, let's go. I adore the Dutch cities, they really figured it out. And the Dutch invented the row house in the age of Vermeer, just when you'd want them to. The British were not slow to pick up on the Dutch invention. Here in London and Bloomsbury, you see plenty of things that the British don't call row houses, they call them terraced houses. This is a crescent of terraced houses in Bloomsbury. The British picked up on the row house invention, and they built a nation of row houses, and we were not far behind. New York, Manhattan, or New York City as it was before 1898, was a city of row houses before it became a city of skyscrapers. And much of Brooklyn is still a city of row houses. And in fact, if New York had never become the greatest city of skyscrapers in the world, we would know it as the greatest city of row houses or brownstones in America and perhaps in the world. And if you go to the Upper East Side or even the Upper West Side of Brooklyn Heights, well, if you don't like it, I can't help you. These are some of the great places in the world. And the row house cities are unusual. If you go just a little bit inland from Holland in Europe and look at the cities of continental Europe, some of them are pretty nice looking. Paris here, nice town, Paris, but it doesn't have row houses. Paris is a city of apartment houses, lovely apartment houses, palatial, monumental apartment houses in many cases, but apartment houses. Very different from London, very different from Amsterdam, very different from Brooklyn, very different from row house cities. And if you go to Rome, Berlin, Vienna, nice towns, but they are towns of apartment houses. They are not row house towns, row house cities. And if you go across the Appalachian Mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, as some people might call them, you find the cities of continental America. I love to ask audiences, which city is this? I'll ask you, which city is this? Come on, be brave. Dallas? Dallas. I hear Dallas. Dallas. I hear Dallas twice. Dallas going once, Dallas going twice. Any other guesses?
Charlotte.
Charlotte? It's a guess?
Someplace in Indiana.
Someplace in Indiana? It's a little large for Terre Haute. Shall we call it Indianapolis? Anything else? Any other guesses?
Kansas.
What?
Kansas.
Kansas City? Well, it happens to be Houston. But that's not important. What's important is that you, an intelligent audience, couldn't tell. That shows that there is a type of city in continental North America, and that doesn't have row houses either. I look at this picture of Houston, and I see at the center skyscrapers. Skyscrapers of really New York density. The center of Houston is a very dense, high, broad-shouldered skyscraper place. The tallest buildings in that picture are 80 stories tall. You probably know exactly how tall they are. Do you know exactly? No, it's Houston. Who cares? And then surrounding this extremely dense skyscraper core is something that to me looks kind of like Arlington National Cemetery. I don't know what else it looks like. It's an extremely low density setup. And this is the way cities get built in continental North America. So you get continental Europe with apartment house cities that are very dense. You get continental North America with sprawling suburban cities that are not very dense at all. And in between, you get the cities that have row houses. And here they are. Here's the list under Nick Noy's beautiful picture of Park Avenue. Amsterdam, Baltimore, Bath, Birmingham, Boston, Bristol, Delft. Work the list. These are the row house cities. And if a row house city is done right, it's kind of Goldilocks. You can imagine Goldilocks goes to Paris, but it's too hard. Or Goldilocks goes to Houston, but it's too soft. And Goldilocks goes to Bath, or Boston, or any of these things, Leiden. And it's just right, because when a row house city is tuned up right, it works fine. But this picture should be clue enough to make you realize that when I was looking for a subject, I kind of went fishing and I hooked a whale. I started out with what seemed like a simple question. Why do some cities have row houses and others don't? But it turned out the row house cities didn't just sit around reproducing row houses for 400 years. They built Park Avenue, among other things. The row house cities have existed for 400 years. And for 400 years, the cities on this list have been each other's major trading partners. On our side of the Atlantic, our first settlers and our building traditions came from the other side of the Atlantic, but they didn't come from Rome and Paris and Vienna. They came from Amsterdam and London and Bristol and Glasgow. These cities grew up together, and these cities have lived together for the last 400 years. This is a family of cities. And like any city, like any family, sometimes they love each other and sometimes they fight. But they go through the same patterns. And these cities have been through the same patterns, the same events for 400 years. And I went fishing and I hooked a whale and I wound up with a real set of ripping yarns about the things that great cities had done, terrible scrapes that they'd got themselves into, like the Industrial Revolution or World War I or something like that, and how they got through them. And one of those stories is the birth of downtown and the meaning of the skyscraper Skyline. And this is something that comes, Carol, in the chapter in this little book that you mentioned, the chapter which is about the 19th century, the chapter of high volume production and high volume transatlantic trade. And that is when downtown is born. Or if you will, that is when downtown is invented. Downtown is a central business district. Downtown is a place where lots and lots of people work and nobody lives, right? Well, downtowns are passing out of existence. But we were all born in an age that had downtowns. And every city in the North Atlantic world had downtowns. And the greatest downtown in the world was right here. But Paris never had a downtown like that. Rome never had a downtown like that. What happened? Here's the story. Think about this picture. On a night in 1666 in London, a baker's apprentice went to sleep too early and didn't bank the fires properly, and a fire broke out. There was a stiff wind blowing, and the Lord Mayor of London, who came out to organize firefighting, they didn't have a fire department, dithered. And the Great Fire of London burned for 4 days. Here is a painting of it. This is St. Paul's Cathedral. And melted lead from the roof of St. Paul's Cathedral flowed down the streets of London in the Great Fire. And when the fire was over, almost all of the city of London within the walls of London had been destroyed. Here are the London walls, these black lines, and the pink area is the burnt district of the Great Fire of London in 1666. The Great Fire of London destroyed St. Paul's Cathedral. It destroyed 101 parish churches. It destroyed 43 guild halls. It destroyed the Royal Exchange. And it destroyed the houses of 80,000 people. It destroyed 14,000 houses, and 80,000 people were made homeless by the Great Fire of London. London in 1666 was a mixed-use area. The business center of the city had 80,000 residents, and the Great Fire made them all homeless. 1666. 206 years later, a fire of comparable magnitude broke out in Boston, Massachusetts, the Great Fire of Boston. Firefighting techniques were better by 1872, but the Boston Fire Department couldn't fight this fire because there was an epidemic that killed horses, and the horse-drawn fire engines of Boston couldn't get to the fire. And by the end of the Great Boston Fire of 1872, Boston looked like Dresden after World War II. The center of Boston had been destroyed, and it was devastation on the scale of the Great Fire of London 206 years earlier. But there was one difference. The Great Fire of London made 80,000 people homeless. The Great Fire of Boston did not destroy one unit of housing. Between 1666 and 1872, we had invented, and when I say we, I mean all of us in the North Atlantic world, and none of us, because we weren't around, unfortunately, we're invented people, we just weren't there. But we in the North Atlantic world, between the Great Fire of London and the Great Fire of Boston, had invented something that you New Yorkers gave a name to. You New Yorkers coined the phrase downtown, and it stuck in America. Every American downtown is a downtown, whether it's down or up or over, because you New Yorkers thought of it as down and thought of north as up, and you New Yorkers have the power to set fashion. And so everybody in America calls it downtown. The Brits don't call it downtown, but we Americans call it downtown. And it was invented between the Great Fire of London in 1666 and the Great Fire of Boston in 1872. You might say, was Boston unique? In many respects, Boston is unique. If you don't believe me, ask Bostonians. They will spend weeks telling you that Boston is unique. But in this sense, Boston is not unique. It's perfectly typical of the North Atlantic cities. It's not typical of Paris, Florence, Rome, Berlin, Vienna. They did not build downtowns and don't have downtowns to this day. They have mixed-use city centers that ramble on for mile after mile. They've never built downtowns, but we did. What happened? What happened? What happened was high-volume trade, and the high-volume trade broke out in the early 19th century, and it had two components, one on each side of the North Atlantic Ocean. On our side, the people of the United States doubled in population between 1790 and 1820, and they doubled the land area of the United States. Here is the United States in 1790. Over there is the United States in 1820. The United States doubled its population, doubled its land area, and when we doubled our land area, we not only got a lot of new land, we got much better land. Many of you probably descend from New England. An awful lot of people in America descend in New England, from New Englanders. Why did so many New Englanders leave New England? Well, you ever tried plowing a field in New England? But when you get out to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, Kentucky, not only did America get twice as big, it got more than twice as productive agriculturally. And America was very quickly growing much more food than we Americans could eat. The rest of the world was hungry, so we had things that we could sell to people if only we could get it there. Meanwhile, the British were inventing the Industrial Revolution. Here are women working in a spinning machine in a factory. And the spinning machine is labeled Platt Brothers, Oldham. Oldham is a neighborhood in Manchester. And Manchester, if you have to pick one city to be the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, pick Manchester. Manchester called itself Cottonopolis, and by the 1820s, it was building factories, according to the German architect Schinkel, building factories bigger than the Royal Palace in Berlin. And England didn't just make soft goods like cloth, it made hard goods. It was the chief maker of all things made of metal. Our grandfather's clock has a nice mahogany case that was made in Baltimore in 1819. When you look at the works, they're stamped Birmingham. And that's not Birmingham, as in Alabama. That's Birmingham, the metallurgical center of England, and for the 19th century, the metallurgical center of the world. So on our side of the Atlantic, we've got more food than we need. On the British side of the Atlantic, we've got more manufactured goods than we need. And after 1815, the two sides could trade freely. This is the Duke of Wellington at the Battle of Waterloo, June 17th, 1815. And the Battle of Waterloo ended the wars of the French Revolution. There had been steady war going on for 23 years. And during those 23 years, it was very difficult to trade across the North Atlantic Ocean. Why? Well, if you traded with the French, the British would try to capture you. If you traded with the British, the French would try to capture you. If you traded with the Spaniards, everybody would try to capture you, including sometimes the Spaniards. The world was at war, and it really restricted international trade for the first 15 years of the 19th century. Meanwhile, of course, America is growing more food every year. England is making more cloth and more clocks every year. It's just hard to trade, and then suddenly peace. Wellington and Blucher beat Napoleon at Waterloo, and the North Atlantic is at peace for 99 years. So far, knock on wood, the longest period of peace that the North Atlantic has ever had. And within 4 years, you have regular packet service across the North Atlantic. It begins here in New York with the ships of the Black Ball Line. That's why there's a black spot there. That's not Long John Silver. That's the symbol of the Black Ball Line. And a bunch of your fellow citizens in 1819 made the bet that they could fill up a ship every week in New York and send it to Liverpool. And they could fill up a ship every week in Liverpool and send it back to New York. And this was the first time that there was enough transatlantic trade to have scheduled freighter service ever. Before 1819, when did a ship sail? It sailed when it was full, and not before. But the fellows in the Black Ball Line bet that they could fill a ship every week on each side of the ocean, and they won their bet because we were growing so much and the British were making so much. Before 1815, most parts of the world had tried to be self-sufficient. They tried to feed themselves. They tried to make what they needed. In the North Atlantic world, beginning in the 19th century, people abandoned any notion of becoming self-sufficient. And instead, people said, where is our competitive advantage? What can we do better than you? And we'll do a lot of it. And what can you do better than we? And we'll buy it from you. And we'll trade. And the volume of trade is huge. It is fed on both sides of the Atlantic by internal improvements that make it possible for more goods to get to market. How does American wheat get to Europe and South America from the Midwest? By the Erie Canal. And the Erie Canal is what makes New York, New York. It's why New York isn't Philadelphia, Boston, or Baltimore. And canals were nice, but railroads were nicer. And here's the first railroad in the world, which ran between Manchester, where cloth was made, and Liverpool, where it was shipped out on the Black Ball Line. And soon everybody gets into the act and builds railroads. And by the middle of the 19th century, the volume of trade has become great enough to spawn the development of absolutely enormous commercial facilities. Here are the East India Docks in London, the East End of London, what's now Canary Wharf and Docklands. These are giant ocean-going ships, and they just look like toys. in a landscape of giant warehouses and man-made docks. If you want to know what these great warehouse environments were like, you can't go here anymore, but you can go to Liverpool. Here's the Albert Dock in Liverpool, and Liverpool built 7.5 miles of enclosed docks. Why did it do that? Why did it build these giant warehouses? Because it needed to. Because the volume of trade was so great. Because we grew so much and they made so much. Because the imbalances were so huge that enormous amounts of stuff had to be shipped and had to be warehoused and had to be wholesaled and had to be retailed. And port cities are transformed by all this high volume of stuff. Here is South Street, the year after the opening of the Erie Canal, 1826. That is a high volume place going on with sailing ships, and people are working as hard as they can given that they don't have any machinery. That's all pure muscle work there in 1826. Here is a mangy slide, forgive the quality of this, of Broadway. And it shows the expansion of business in New York up Broadway. Everything you see in this picture was built to be a row house. These are nice old merchants' houses from New York in about 1800. But by the time this picture was made in about 1830, and forgive me, it's not clear enough, you can't see it, but you'll have to trust me. There are signs for different businesses on every floor of these buildings. There is so much stuff to be warehoused, so much stuff to be bought and sold, that merchants have to move out to make room for storing it all. And the problem is the buildings that they have at their disposal. Here is a typical building of 1800, more or less. It's 30 feet wide, and it takes up a very low percentage of its land. There's another building here and another building there, but there's just empty land here. Why is there so much empty land? Because every room needs to have a window. There's no good artificial light. You can have windows front and windows back, but if you want to have more than 2 rooms, you need to make your back wing narrower so you can have windows on the side. A building like that is very inefficient. It makes a very inefficient use of land. And if you don't believe me, there are wonderful exhibits around the walls here that will explain it to you just brilliantly. And then there's something else. You see these dark lines? These dark lines are walls made of brick. And houses in 1800 had lots of internal walls made of brick. Why? To support the floors above them. And they did a fine job of supporting the floors above them. They were generally well made. The problem is that if you want to use a house like this as a warehouse, you can barely move things from one place to another. You have this inflexible floor plan. And so that's why you get merchants having to move out of their houses to make room for their goods. And that's what goes on until 3 inventions come together in the 1840s. In the 1840s, you start to get efficient gas lighting. And that means that you don't need to be near a window. In the 1840s, cast iron becomes inexpensive. And people realize that a couple of slender cast iron columns can hold up a floor. And in fact, they can hold up 5 or 6 floors. And you don't need brick walls. And you can have big rooms with lots of open space, and you can move wheelbarrows around, and you can have workers making things. And then finally, in the 1840s or the early 50s, steam engines get, relatively speaking, miniaturized. And it becomes possible to have a steam-powered freight elevator in a relatively small building. When these 3 things come together, the centers of cities are transformed. Here is Manchester in 1823. Here's the center of Manchester in 1823. And all of these houses have lots of brick walls on the inside, and every room has a window. And by the middle of the 19th century, that same street looks like this. Everything gets torn down and gets replaced with buildings that are taller, have wide open spaces, and cover their entire lots. These buildings, pretty as they are, had about 2 square feet of building for every square feet of land. These buildings have 5 or 6 square feet of building for every square foot of land. And they can store 2-3 times more space. Stuff, they can make 2-3 times more space. And Manchester becomes what one of the great British historians calls the shock city of the 1840s. And the merchants of Manchester build warehouses and factories of palatial scale. The Watts warehouse in Manchester was built in 1856. It's a luxury hotel today, and it is spectacular. And it looks like a royal palace, and it's just something for making and storing cotton cloth. And if you wander around Manchester, look at these fabulous commercial buildings. Britain was richer than we were in the middle of the 19th century. British merchants had a bigger trade than American merchants did, and they built in expensive materials on a palatial scale with dramatic and detailed architecture. And this is just Manchester. I wish I could show you what London did, but the Luftwaffe deprived me of the pleasure. This is the second greatest Victorian downtown in England. It's the best we've got, and it's just amazing. And look at this. I mean, this is just fabulous stuff. By now we're in 1880, and this is Manchester. How many of you have ever been to Manchester? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I mean, it's not a tourist attraction. And for most of the 19th century, it was conceivably the worst place to live in the English-speaking world. All of this money meant ghastly squalor for a couple of million people. But there was lots of money, and it built some amazing architecture, and there was a huge amount of stuff, all of which had to be made, all of which had to be stored, all of which had to be wholesaled and retailed. And fabulous detail. Here's a commercial building. Is that a cathedral? No, that's somebody's cotton business. Look, that's not plaster. That's hard stone that was carved by a human being with a chisel. When? You can read it, 1868. Alex, hear good music. Here's Alex Garvin, who wrote the foreword to this book, and God bless you.
It's a fabulous book. But I noticed something today that I didn't realize. My last book is a counterpoint to yours, because I have the point that the downtown starts changing, and what were the inventions that have forced the change in Lower Manhattan and the other places?
Alex has written a book about 6 months ago called The Center of the City. It's about downtown, you probably buy it here. Heart of the City, sorry.
Right here, yeah.
And we're mutual admiration.
Yes, we are.
This man knows more about cities than anyone I have ever met. God bless you.
You are quite a competitor.
So, thank you.
Thanks.
People in the back, there are 3 seats right here.
Good. So, good. Do come forward. Thanks. So, this is magnificent commercial architecture, and it's the first magnificent commercial architecture built in the world since the Italian Renaissance. It's magnificent and it's expensive. It's the expression of rich and mighty British merchants. Well, what about us? We need space indoors as much as the British do. And we have pokey little old buildings. We're just not as rich as the British are, so what do? Well, at first, we move out and we begin to build larger buildings, but we're not as rich as the British. And when we're building in masonry, these buildings in Broadway are not very fancy, except for one of them. Can you see the one that's fancy? Well, it's hard to see, it's blurry. But this building is really different from the others. How is it different? Well, it's different because of the guy who built this building. This is the Bogardus building, which is the first building built with an iron skin. And it was built that way because the iron front building was invented by James Bogardus. This was over in Murray Street. Murray Street was not a salubrious location. It was a good place to have a foundry. So Bogardus builds a factory building in, I think, 1849, 49?
About right.
Be about right. And by 1851, he gets a client to build an office building. And here's what binds me to you. Here is one of your great people, one of your great builders, linked to one of our great developers, because the first iron building, all iron building in the world, is built in Baltimore. It's the building of the Baltimore Sun, built in 1851, same year as the Crystal Palace in London. And a lot of people can work in the Baltimore Sun building. There they all are. And not only that, but the Baltimore Sun building and Bogardus's revolutionary technique of cast iron for the outside of a building means that merchants can get the beautiful designs of Italian Renaissance architecture for a fraction of the price of what British merchants are paying to have the same stuff built of stone and brick. American merchants in 1850 are still poorer than British merchants, and James Bogardus figures out how we can be grand on the cheap. And that turns out to be a fruitful invention. And you wind up with iron front buildings all over New York and all over every American city. Here's an example. Here's the main street of my city, Baltimore, in 1850, lined with pretty little old buildings that have lots of windows and lots of internal masonry walls. Along comes the iron building, and there's the same street 20 years later, a piece of it. And those buildings have 7 times more lot coverage or 5 times more lot coverage or something. And why are they built? They're built because there's just so much stuff being grown, just so much stuff being made. It all has to go somewhere. And it has to go in the center of town so that country merchants can come and buy it from city merchants. And there is perhaps the greatest surviving iron front building in the world, the Howard Building. How do you spell Howard? H-A-U-G-H-W-O-U-T. Nick Noyes took this picture. Nick, Broadway and what? What's the side street? Broome?
Sounds good.
Broome? Yeah. That was the first building in America, I think the first building in the world to have a passenger elevator, 1857. And that shows how a revolutionary invention allowed American merchants to be grand on the cheap and to do things as well as British merchants could do, but a great deal less expensively. To store goods. As the 19th century went on, people invented railroads. Think about running a railroad. I want to ship a bale of cotton from New Orleans to Liverpool, or on a shipping line or something. You have to load a bale onto a train, and you have to know which car it's in, and it has to get off at the right place. And you need an enormous amount of correspondence, and they don't have computers yet. And you get one of the 19th century inventions, which is office work. All of a sudden, in order to do anything, whether it's running a railroad, running a shipping line, the new industry of life insurance, all of these things require huge amounts of bookkeeping and correspondence. And you get armies of clerks who come to work every day and pride themselves on their copper plate hands and take up an enormous amount of space. And as office work is invented, so also are office buildings invented. And you can see it in Wall Street. Wall Street in 1840 is still pretty low. It's got some banks that look like Greek temples, but it has an awful lot of row houses just kind of happily sitting there with lots of windows and lots of masonry walls. By 1860, by the Civil War, all of those have been torn down. And you have big buildings that cover their whole lot, and they're full of clerks for bankers and merchant houses. Then along in 1856 comes Elisha Otis, who invents the passenger elevator. And by 1880, Wall Street looks like that. Trinity Church keeps shrinking. How does it do that? You need to put some plant food on it. By 1880, you've got buildings that are, or 90, you would know, somewhere in there, before the steel frame. You've got tall buildings with passenger elevators, and it takes high-pressure water so that you can run bathrooms on a 10th floor. All kinds of inventions have to happen. And then along comes the steel frame, and look at poor little Trinity Church down there. Poor little sweet thing. It looks like something in a Christmas garden at a firehouse. All of these people that it takes to run the high-volume economy. This is downtown. This is one of the great 19th century inventions. And in the daytime, it is mobbed with people. And at night and on weekends, it is pin drop quiet. And those of you who can remember Lower Manhattan before it became a mixed-use area will remember this. My father took me down to Wall Street when I was 8 years old. It was very disappointing. Midtown was lots of fun, but there was nothing happening in Wall Street on a Saturday. This, for better or worse, is downtown. It is an invention of the 19th century. It was created by huge imbalances of trade across the North Atlantic Ocean. It embraced London and Manchester on one side. It embraced New York and Baltimore and Boston on the other. It invented a new kind of urban district. And in the process, it allowed middle-class people to stand up straight and feel proud of themselves architecturally. Very quickly, what the hell am I talking about? Well, if you have ever approached Athens, I hope you have, you realize that what you see from a distance, the skyline of ancient Athens, is a fortress surmounted by temples. This is how Athens advertised itself to the surrounding countryside. And you would say to yourself, the chief concerns of these people are worship and warfare. They have temples on top of a fortress. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and things are surprisingly not very different. Here is Arundel down on the south coast of England, a giant castle, the seat of the Duke of Norfolk. And in the background, Arundel Cathedral. And if you're on a train, and I wish I'd taken a picture from a train, I didn't, I had to find this online and it doesn't get it, but the trains are way down here and you look up and it's worship and warfare. It's the castle and the cathedral. So from Athens to the Middle Ages, you could look at a city skyline and you knew what it was about. If you're Rome, you can look at the city skyline and you know what it's about. It is a city of churches, of domes, and you look at it and you say, this must be an ecclesiastical center. Well, got it in one, that's what it is. But what's this? This looks like Rome. The dominant buildings are the domes of churches. You would look at this and you would say, it must be an ecclesiastical center. But it's not. This is Florence. This is the greatest merchant city of the Italian Renaissance. The high priests of Florence were merchants. Their acolytes were lawyers and accountants. The skyline of Florence in the Renaissance is a beautiful thing, but it doesn't tell you what the city is about. And things were no different in New York in 1800. Here is a view of New York in 1800. And you would look at it, and the only things you can see are boats and church spires. And you would say, well, I guess it must be an ecclesiastical center with boats. I don't know, what would you say about that? And you look at what they are: Trinity Church, Presbyterian Meeting, North Dutch Church, St. George's Chapel. You would say, gee, whatever New York is, it must be an ecclesiastical center. Well, it's not an ecclesiastical center, it's New York. New York hadn't figured out how to show the world what it was about. And by 1850, when this beautiful lithograph depicted Union Square New York looking south from Union Square, you can't tell what that's about. You have no idea what that's about. That's just a bunch of something. You really can't tell. That is a completely inarticulate city. And it might be fun to walk there, and it might be the worst walk you've ever had in your life. And it might be about this or it might be about that. It is completely inarticulate. And by the middle of the 19th century, these cities of 5-story buildings were inarticulate from any distance. And the skyscraper changes that. This, my personal favorite view of any skyscraper skyline anywhere. The skyline, not just the individual skyscraper, but the skyline of skyscrapers. Chicago may have invented the skyscraper, but you New Yorkers invented the skyline. And the skyline that you built in the first quarter of the 20th century is the authoritative skyline, I think, in the history of the world. And you can look at that skyline and you can tell what that city is about. That city is about commerce. That city is about enterprise. And you can approach that city on one of these ships and you can say, it doesn't look easy, but it's possible. Whatever it is, it's possible, even though it's not easy. And so the skyscraper and the skyscraper skyline aren't just fun to look at. They have meaning, and they made commercial cities intelligible from a distance for the first time. That's one of the cool stories that I dug up in researching the cities that began by having row houses. And I thank you very much, and I thank you, Carol, for letting me in. And this is a great museum. Come back. Thank you so much. Yes.
I went to a wonderful exhibit of the painter Turner after the Napoleonic War.
Yep.
And how excited he was to travel all over Europe.
Yes.
And it had not ever occurred to me, but you brought it back. There were many years where you couldn't travel. And I hope we aren't approaching anything like that.
Well, I hope we're not approaching it. I hope one of you can tell me, even the great art historian Erwin Panofsky couldn't tell me, why we use a French word, Renaissance, to describe an Italian historical phenomenon. And I think it's because in the beginning of the 19th century, the French could get to Italy and the English could not. Italy was on the other side. I think it's also why you get a revival of Greek architecture in the early 19th century. French architects could get to Italy. English architects had to go to Greece.
And was there a French pope at the time too?
No.
No.
That was the pope that Napoleon took prisoner, and he had to be ransomed by one of his cardinals.
Yeah,
So
the French were all over Italy.
the French were all over Italy. They kind of ran the show. Yep. Any more? Well, thanks. Where are people supposed to go and what are they supposed? Oh, is there another?
Where did it look like?
Oh, is there another question? Yeah.
In like 3 sentences, why do we have, why did the North Atlantic cities all have row houses?
In 3 sentences, why do the North Atlantic cities have row houses?
Or 10 sentences?
If you cast your minds back to 1600, every city north of the Alps was built the same way. You had 2 kinds of houses. There were wooden and half-timbered ancestors of row houses for the common people. And they were mostly rattle-trap shacks. And the standard way of fighting a fire was not to throw water on the fire, but just to pull the house down. That's why a hook and ladder company has a hook. And about 99% of the people lived in these shacks, and 1% of the people lived in urban palaces, which looked kind of like colleges at Oxford or Cambridge. They had big courtyards and armed guards at the gate and things like that. In continental Europe, you had powerful kings and powerful courts, and those kings set fashion. And big, dukes wanted to have palaces that were almost like the kings, but a little smaller, and counts wanted to have palaces that were almost like the dukes, but a bit smaller. And by the time you got down to lawyers and merchants in cities, they wanted to have palaces too. They couldn't afford a palace, but they found they could rent 3 rooms in a big building that looked like a palace, and you get the apartment house. Why did the Dutch invent what we think of as the row house? Because the Dutch invented what we think of as a middle-class nation. The Dutch didn't have a king. Although they had noblemen, their noblemen were poor and they didn't count for anything. Who ran Holland? The guys in plain black coats who sat for portraits to Rembrandt and Hals. They had all grown up in rattle-trap shacks that were connected to each other. They were commoners, they weren't nobles. And they figured out how to turn the rattle-trap urban shack of commoners into classical architecture made of durable materials. And it's so the row house is really the sign that your society is run by people of moderate wealth. And the British pick it up in precisely the generation when they cut off the king's head and Parliament becomes the supreme body in the land. So that in a nutshell is it. Yes?
Did any row houses exist in Asia? And I'm specifically thinking of Shanghai. And there's a street in Baltimore that I always homewood, and I always say that it looks like row houses in Shanghai, but I'm wondering if there is a comparison.
I think it's time for a field trip. So, I would gladly tell you if I knew, but I do happen to know because I sat in on a thesis presentation at Bryn Mawr College 3 years ago, where a nice girl from Shanghai was presenting her thesis on Shanghai developments that were a Chinese interpretation of working class row houses from the north of England. And her pictures didn't make them look like any part of England I'd ever been to. So I say, I think it's time for a field trip.
So, if that is the last question, then it probably is a good time to end. In any case, we're not ending because there's a reception right over there with some wine and pretzels, but there are also, more importantly, books. And there are books in the bookstore in a pile. There are books on the desk here, or on the table. If you purchase one of those, take it down to the store, pay for it, and then come back and have Charlie sign and inscribe it to you.
Well,
Or
which I would
buy a
love to do.
Christmas present.
Or buy a Christmas present. Or buy lots of Christmas presents.
And it's very economical at $29.99.
$29.99. Published by the Blue Coat Press in Liverpool.
Yeah, good.
Wonderful.
Charlie's fan club is here tonight, and it's probably the first time for many of you here to the museum. Is that right? Are there a lot of people who are here for the first time? Yeah? Okay, great. Well, welcome. So that means I have to introduce myself. I'm Carol Willis, and I'm the founder, director, and curator of the museum. And for those of you for whom it is the first time, we're here for 15 years and counting now, open since 2004. Oh yes, please sit. There's some seats right here in the front if you want to be closer. I know Charlie will be able to project, as I will talk louder also. And we do hold authors' talks on topics of high-rise history, urbanism generally, New York City history in particular is one of our favorite topics. And every month we have an author on a whole wide range of topics. I'll mention the upcoming January and February talks because it gives you an idea of the diversity, and maybe you'll come back as well. In January, I forget the exact date right now, Thomas Campanella, who is a professor at Cornell, is talking about his book on Brooklyn. Josh, what is the title of the Brooklyn book? I forget, like Brooklyn's the World or something. Just plain, no, there's a subtitle then. Okay. In any case,
The second greatest city in the world.
Delightful that book. Well, as Marisa Lago told me that the other day, it's now the third, if it were its own city, it'd be the third largest city in America. So yes, substantial municipality on its own. And rising, I guess. And so on the topic of cities, and then in February, A.K. Sandoval Strauss, who's a very interesting urban historian, teaches at Penn State, will talk about his new book, Barrio City, about Latin America, well, Latin communities, Latinx communities, and immigrant kind of renaissance of American cities, an urban and material culture historian. So you can see we have a wide variety of topics. And tonight with Charlie's new book, and a book of a lifetime, right? Because you've been
10 years.
right, only 10 years. Well, that's pretty common actually to have spent only 10 years on any book that any author in our series will discuss. The North Atlantic cities is, and I just dipped into it, but you know, I'm very impressed with the parts that I have read already, and I wanted to mention a little bit of what I did sample in the center. But I know, and in part because Alice Garvin, who wrote the introduction to the book, is right here, that the book looks across the North Atlantic, obviously, at cities of the perspective not of imperialism, not kind of mother cities, but equal cities in a way. I take it that kind of generate in time and place, kind of from their own energies, but which are very similar, and so have the as merchant cities and have their commonalities even across or on both, let's say, on both sides of the Atlantic, and I think that's what you're going to talk about for us today.
Okay.
Right? Yeah. And so most of you know Charlie much better than I do, and you know that he's a developer and trained as an architect, that he has developed and revitalized, please do, apartment houses and houses in Baltimore, and rebuilding and revitalizing the communities of Baltimore has been his project for much of his career. He also headed Jubilee Baltimore, a not-for-profit organization devoted to those same aims, and served as its president for 19 years. He also has been the president of the Baltimore Architecture Foundation, is that right? And has done good work, obviously, throughout that city, which is so rich in history. Please do. So, in the part of the book that I've sampled so far, which is, now I just took my bookmark out, but let's see, it is about Manchester. What's the title? High volume
The
cities.
Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, which I thought was a really interesting take on these towns or cities. And in sampling the prose, I was impressed with the kind of clarity of the writing, but also the common sense, but also the humor that you could find in describing these massive machinations of the cities. And there was this phrase about the cities in a race to save themselves from public health catastrophes and social revolution at the same time. And then he goes on to talk about Dickens and apropos to Christmas, Tiny Tim, and a city that Dickens knew that was actually a better London than the one that came before, but it was Dickens who was seeing through the lens of worse situation. And I thought that this was a real insight in thinking about the 19th century English city. So I look forward to hearing more about that tonight and putting it in the context of both sides of the Atlantic.
Bless you.
Charlie Duff.
Thank you very much.